spent a long, snowy winter in Vermont. So when I got off the plane yesterday and it was 90 degrees, that felt really good. So a couple of questions. One is just to gauge the audience. How many of you went on the run this morning? Okay. And how many of you went to the party last night? All right, that gives me a sense of you. So what I want to do this morning is to take a deep dive into the future. I'm going to take a deep dive into the future. But I'm going to follow the author William Gibson's observation that the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So let me give you some examples of that. First, how many of you have called an Uber in the last week? How many of you watched a movie streaming over Netflix? How many of you have checked Facebook in the last couple of days? And how many of you have checked an app on your smartphone in the last 5 seconds? All right. So think about these capabilities. Now, think about the fact that 10 years ago, almost none of these capabilities existed. Early versions, perhaps, or just released. In some cases, it's glimmers in the inventor's eyes. 10 years. Right. And in the 10 years since then, these companies that represent these capabilities are among some of the world's most valuable companies. Right? Apple, literally the most valuable company in the world. Facebook, largest media company. Uber and its like, some of the largest transportation companies. Netflix, one of the largest entertainment companies. In 10 years, from essentially nothing or a standing start to this. And these companies and the ecosystem that they influence employ millions of people. They affect billions of customers. And just these 4 companies represent almost $1.7 trillion in market value. And you look at the competitors and the ecosystems they enabled, trillions more. Right? That's the impact that technology can have in a relatively short amount of time. Where we look at it and we say, wow, that's really new, but that's over there. This stuff is no longer really new, and it's everywhere. But it's not necessarily embedded into your industries or your companies. So it's not for no reason that a recent PwC survey showed that 85% of insurance CEOs globally are concerned with technological disruption. 85%. And these are the CEOs of your companies or the clients that you serve. And the fact of the matter is that the reason they're concerned is because innovation is really hard. Right? The graveyards of business are littered with companies that used to be great and are no longer great. 10 years ago, half the Fortune 500 companies that were on it are no longer on it today, on the Fortune 500 list. Innovation is really hard. And that's why, globally, across all industries, senior executives, such as yourselves, are really dissatisfied with the innovation performance in their own companies. 94% in a McKinsey survey from about a year and a half ago. 94% of executives are dissatisfied with the innovation performance of their own companies. So this question of innovation at the intersection of strategy and technology is the question that I've been working on my entire career. I have 4 books on various aspects on both the winners and the losers, and what separates them from the others, and what kind of patterns point to potential success or potential failure. So what I'm going to do this morning is to draw from those books and simply offer you 5 lessons. 5 lessons on what separates winners from losers as you think about disruptive innovation. So let me just jump right into it. Lesson number 1 is to embrace the gap. And this is the gap I'm talking about. Technology, as we know, improves exponentially. What do you think about Moore's law in terms of the core hardware components? When you think about network effects and Metcalfe's law about the value of networks over time, when you think about the law of diminishing returns, it's all exponential. And has followed that pattern for decades and will continue to, because there's an immense economic and technological motivation for that progress to continue. Now, if you think about your companies and every other company, the natural tendency is to change incrementally. We're optimized around the people that we have, the technologies that we've already built, the processes we've created, the customers that we have. That's what we've won on, and the natural tendency is not to change that, is to change incrementally. It's human nature. So what happens over time is that this exponential progression of capability meets up against an incremental tendency inside organizations, and a gap exists. And that's what I mean by killer app. A killer app is something that takes a capability and turns it into an actuality. And as a result, introduces a new capability or new product into a marketplace, or sometimes creates a whole new one. Because markets abhor vacuums. Over time, someone will take that capability and turn it into something that customers want, even if those customers had told them beforehand they did not want that. So this is the gap that you need to embrace, the difference between incremental and disruptive. And it varies for every one of you, and it varies for every sector of your industry. But searching out that gap is what I'm going to focus on this morning. Now, there's a long history, of course, of companies that were great and stayed on that incremental curve and are no longer with us, and other companies that jumped on the exponential. And oftentimes, it's not about technology, or at least it's not about the knowledge of technology. If you look at Kodak, they literally invented the sensor at the heart of the digital camera. They owned a patent on that. But for 25 years, Kodak spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, trying to figure out how that digital sensor could be an incremental prop to their real business of film, chemical, and paper. It's not that they didn't understand the technology, but they tried to harness that technology in an incremental way to boost up their existing business model. Because, of course, if you have essentially a worldwide monopoly on film, chemical, and paper, and you're making 60 to 70% margins, why would you invest in anything else? Right? You can imagine every quarter there's a discussion that says, digital, we should do something about digital. Yes, of course we should do something about digital, but we're not going to get into a business of 20 to 30% margin. We're going to use digital to build up this business. And every quarter, it was a very logical decision. So that's why in the 90s, Kodak actually spent $500 million creating a new camera system that had within it, the heart of the camera, a digital sensor. Now, does anybody remember the Advantage camera system? It came out in the late 90s and was actually awarded the Product of the Year award by a industry magazine. And do you know what it did with that sensor in the middle of the camera? You could take a picture, preview the image, but you couldn't store the image. You couldn't mail the image. You couldn't extract the image in any way. You certainly couldn't print it. What you could do with the image was use it, look at it, and mark how many copies of the print you wanted. How many copies of the print that you wanted, which was actually a real customer problem, right? Because you remember in the old days, some of you are not old enough to remember the old days, but in the old days, you would take a roll of film, you take it to the store, they would print you one copy of each and give you the negatives. And then you have to sort of look through the 36 copies or 36 prints and say, which ones those do I like? Which ones do I want to get blown up? Which ones do I want more copies of? So they were actually addressing a very real customer need on that incremental line, and of course, left whole digital photography to somebody else. That's what I mean about embracing the gap. Embracing that gap in terms of your business models, your products, and changes to the incremental. And of course, as you know, and there's much discussion about it, there was yesterday, there will be more today, about the technologies that are disrupting your business today. And these are technologies that are disrupting, I believe, every information-intensive industry. Social media, mobile devices, cloud computing, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, big data. I don't have to tell you about them because you're all grappling with what to do with them. And as you think about these technologies and other more narrow ones, I encourage you to think about how you embrace that gap with these technologies. So how do you do that? Lesson number 2 is you have to think big. And when I say think big, I mean essentially you have to follow what's the possibilities on that exponential curve. You have to have the audacity to say, if I took away everything, started with a clean sheet of paper, how might my business look? How could I think really, really big? Or you have to have the courage to say, look, even if I don't do it, what happens if somebody else takes these capabilities and creates products or services or experiences that can come at me? So because strategy and planning is all about the width of the consideration set, right? How large the range of possibilities that you're going to explore and consider and work into your planning process. So thinking big is really, really important because, of course, if you never imagine the possibility, there's no way you're going to meet it. There's no way you're going to find it. So let me give you an example. What I want to do is use the automotive industry as an example for 3 reasons. One is, here's an industry that essentially has had the same major players for the last 100 years, fighting against each other globally across a whole suite of product sets. So if disruption can happen here in automotive, it really can happen anywhere. Second, of course, we're all customers, so we can relate to examples in this area. And third, of course, we know that what happens in automotive has a large impact on insurance as well. So thinking big in the automotive industry, the first example you're all users of, right? How can you take the capabilities that we all have in our phones, pair with cloud computing, and change the user experience in terms of mobility? These are the really sort of fundamental capabilities that enable the likes of Uber, Lyft, and Didi. And at one level, it's really simple. At another level, it's very imaginative. How do you reimagine taking supply from a different source, addressing customer pain points like the ambiguity about whether or not a taxi will come at the right time, whether or not it will take the same route, the right route, whether you'll get a fair charge, and how can you take the friction out of the experience, like the whole financial exchange? Package that all together, and you have a ride-sharing experience. Right? It seems like no big deal once you're into it, and somehow it was created out of whole cloth. And it happened so fast and so quickly that within a span of just a couple of years, in a major market like New York, ride-sharing rides overtake taxi, right? Our canonical yellow taxi cabs. That's how powerful and how fast it can happen. But of course, the customer experience in terms of the interaction between customers and drivers with automobiles can be much worse than having to stand in the rain waiting for a taxi. Right. Each year, more than 35,000 people die in car accidents just in the US. 2.5 million people are injured. More than 6 million reported accidents involving more than 10 million cars. Think about it, this is at one level the poor interaction between our customers and the products that we serve to them. Right? The poor interaction between customers and products that the automotive industry gives to them. And it has a huge economic cost beyond the human one. Direct costs of more than $250 billion each year. Factoring quality of life and opportunity costs, almost $900 billion just in the US. Globally, more than 1 million people die each year in car accidents, and more than 50 million people are injured. So it's not getting any better. We thought there was a dip in terms of traffic crash fatalities in the US, but the curves are going back up. So one way of thinking about all of this is that it's human error, but the other way of thinking about it is it's human error in terms of how they interact with the products that are sold to them. So what if you could actually take these technologies and reimagine the core product? You take the capabilities around artificial intelligence, cloud computing, Internet of Things, and create cars that don't require drivers. And in a way, this is getting on the exponential curve, taking advantage of technology to not just build safer cars, but build cars that take away the largest element of error. And this is what it looks like.
Since 2009, our team at Google has been developing fully self-driving technology and testing it on real city streets every single day. Until, after more than 1 million miles, we were ready to take a big step forward. In 2015, we completed the world's first truly driverless ride on public roads. Just a person in a car, no steering wheel, no pedals, navigating everyday traffic.
Well, I've never been in Austin, Texas. Now I'm driving in Austin, Texas. It's a profound experience for me to be alone in a car. A very important segment of my life was cut away when my vision failed, and a self-driving car would give me a huge part of my life back.
This is just the beginning.
And that was just the beginning. When Google started working on this self-driving car, well, they kept it secret for a long time, but when they first came out, almost a universal response in the industry was, "Are you kidding me? That's never going to work," right? Especially in the automotive sector, they would say things like, "You know, we've been working on that stuff for decades, and it's just not ready." But when Google made the progress that it did, the response was more like this, right? In 2015 and 2016, this is what automotive executives started thinking. Oh my goodness, maybe these guys can actually do it. Or maybe they can actually do more than what's happening. So nobody would be paying the kind of attention to autonomous driving or driverless cars that's going on now. But because Google sparked the system, now you have essentially an arms race in automotive technology, not only driverless cars, but other elements of safety features. And that impact, that wider impact, I think will have a faster effect on insurance than anybody had ever imagined just a few years ago, especially when we first saw the Google driverless car. So when Volvo says, by 2020, no one will die in our cars, that has enormous implications. And perhaps the best example is GM, who a few years ago when I talked to a senior executive there, his response was essentially, not in my career's lifetime, but in a few years they went out and spent more than $1 billion on acquisitions to bring in the technology capabilities. They've paired up those startups with some of the best engineers in Michigan at GM, a full production team around that capability. And now they're talking about they've retooled factories to build production level driverless cars, and they have designs for whole new generations of cars that actually don't even have steering wheels. This is GM we're talking about, right? That's how fast and how momentous these kinds of capabilities can be. So once you reimagine the core product, you can start doing things like reimagining the business model. So one way of thinking about the user experience like Uber and driverless cars is that you can move to a business model where instead of selling cars, you're selling mobility. Right? So rather than buying a car, you call an Uber. And instead of a driver coming, you have a driverless car coming. And for none of the upfront costs of owning a car, none of the maintenance, licensing, all of those things, you have a chauffeur service at less than the cost of owning a car. That's the model that people are aiming for. And it's happening really fast. Just in the last week, Google, or Waymo, its spinoff, has reaffirmed that its plans to start a self-driving car service in Phoenix this year. Multiple states, even after recent accidents, are welcoming self-driving cars. And not just Uber, not just Waymo, not just GM, but a number of other startups are starting to pilot really significant services in this regard. And the reason is this. Safety is a big issue, but they think they found a business model that actually makes this a better business than the process of selling cars. This is a quote from Bloomberg just last week. Operating margins for OEMs, who've always complained that they're in the business of bending the metal and letting other people make the profits, can start thinking about how do they change their own operating models and start making better profits. The opportunity in the US, if you just take the 3.2 trillion vehicle miles traveled in the US each year and take 10% of that and charge a conservative $1.50 a mile, that's almost a $500 billion business opportunity. Just on a 10% slice of the vehicle miles traveled. It's very, very significant. And of course, if you change that part of the value chain, everything else goes up for grabs. Right? So, each year, tier one suppliers get almost $300 billion in sales. OEMs, $500 billion. New car sales of more than $500 billion. The numbers go on and on. Now, in a world with driverless cars, it's not that all those numbers, all that costs get saved by someone. It's just that they go up for grabs, right? And of course, the big number that you should be thinking about is that $247 billion in insurance premiums, right? Because we know we're going to need insurance, but what kind of insurance do we need? If accidents go down, how much insurance do we need? If the customer experience changes, how is that insurance delivered? So there are a lot of direct implications just from this one technological innovation on your industry or the clients that you serve. But if you're thinking big about insurance, there's a lot more to think about than driverless cars. So if Edward Lloyd from Lloyd's of London fame came back today and he looked at the insurance industry value chain, what would he say? I think he would say something like, oh, yeah, that's pretty much how we did it. Because for hundreds of years, we used technology to reimagine the value chain from a faster, better, cheaper perspective. But has there been any fundamental change in how insurance works? If Alexander Graham Bell came back, he would say, wow, look at the telecommunications industry. Look at all the apps and devices and all that. And he'd probably marvel at the fact that some of the most profitable companies in the world depend on telephony, but almost none of them make a penny on connecting phone calls. Right? Look at the difference. So what are the killer apps in insurance? I mean, there's some really interesting things happening, as you well know. Snapsheet, the idea of why can't we just let the customer take a picture of the collision and make the claim as opposed to having the adjuster? How can we change the customer experience? And then that simple capability flowing back into the process and starts things like, whoa, can we automatically use that tag data to automatically analyze the collisions and crashes? Can we use that connection between customers and the rest of the value chain to re-engineer going backward? Or Trove, insurance on demand as you need it. Or even starting to change business models like Lemonade does. These are all opportunities for reimagining insurance. But you can even think bigger, right? What have you thought about insurance not as how it affects, or the disruption not it affects how your companies operate, but you think about how does all this technology affect the innovation capabilities of our clients, and how can we think about insurance as a lubricant for that innovation? Right? How can we think about insurance and the management of risk and the putting off of risk as an accelerator for the kinds of disruption that are happening in all information-intensive industries which you serve? I think that's a great opportunity. So let me just move forward quickly. A few more lessons. When you start thinking big, the most important thing, as the next step is to not fall in love with your ideas, right? To break those ideas down and think about how you get data as opposed to going on hope. And in that, I love this quote from Gordon Bell, who was the inventor of the mini computer and a good friend. He says, "A demo is worth 1,000 pages of a business plan." So rather than doing big planning, as big companies do, how can you get out there as quickly as possible and test your ideas? So when Google started its driverless car effort, Larry Page and Sergey Brin said to the team, "Look, I'll give you 2 years. I want you to drive 1,000 miles. Drive 1,000 miles. Build me a car that can drive 1,000 miles by itself. And I don't want just any 1,000 miles. I want 1,000 miles in interesting places, like cross all the Bay Bridges, go down Highway 101, go down Lombard Street, be able to traverse around Lake Tahoe. Give me 1,000 miles." And after they went to 1,000 miles, they said, "Okay, now drive 100,000 miles." And it wasn't until they drove 100,000 miles on real roads that any of us heard about it. And they started thinking about what are the business opportunities here. Because they knew if they could create this great capability and prove themselves that it worked, the possibilities were very, very huge. So after you break it down and start small, the key is to create a structure for learning fast. Because in the end, it's all about cycle time, right? It's all about how quickly you can take your ideas and build over time. So since Google has started, they've had 8 generations of cars. Now, many people are getting into the game, but it's going to be hard to catch up with all that learning. They drive 20 to 25,000 weeks, 20 to 25,000 miles on real roads each week, and they've accumulated over 5 million miles of driverless cars on the road. And they take those 5 billion miles and they extract the most interesting cases, and in simulators, they have 25,000 virtual cars running against variations of these cases. So every time they have changes to their algorithm, they can go back and test those algorithms against those cases. That's a powerful mechanism for learning. So in the virtual world, and of course, the computers don't know whether or not they're in the real world or in the virtual world, they're driving more than 3 million miles a day. And collectively are over 5 billion miles traveled and almost 6 billion. That's learning, right? And this is what it looks like today. They have announced, as I said earlier, that in a 100 square mile area in Phoenix, they're going to have point-to-point service, any point-to-any-point service, something that nobody else is contemplating at this point. And that's going to be a next stage test bed for interacting the technology with unplanned customer experiences and see where that goes. And this is what it looks like.
Okay, day 1 of self-driving. Are you ready? Go.
Oh, this is weird.
This is the future.
Yeah, she was like, is there no one driving that car?
I knew it. I was waiting for it.
You'd certainly never know that there wasn't someone driving his car.
Yo, car!
Selfie.
Thank you, car.
Yeah, thank you, car.
And they're not the only ones doing this, as I said earlier. Here's another example of something announced just last week. What you have in this area is a tremendous amount of testing and innovation. And I know the natural tendency in insurance to look at all of this and say, this will take a really long time. This will take a really, really long time. And even as they develop these, the fact that it reaches a scale to affect our industry is going to be even longer. And there's a lot of rational reasons for that kind of argument. But one of the things I want you to think about is there's a line in The Sun Also Rises where one of Hemingway's characters says to another, "How did you go bankrupt gambling?" And the response is, "Well, first, very gradually, and then very suddenly." And I think that is the impact of this technology on your industry, and really the impact on a number of these technologies on your industry. So a final lesson, and I'll close. Here's just one last bit on this. Google Waymo has announced plans to buy 20,000 cars from Jaguar with the estimate that in 2 years, they're going to be offering 1 million rides a day. Still, you think about 1 million rides in the context of that 3.2 trillion vehicle miles traveled, not very much, but it's the next stage of that gradual and then suddenly process. Because in this game, and in yours, it's the fastest learner, not the first mover, nor the fast follower. It's the fastest learner that wins. So let me close with one last lesson. And this is a lesson I learned from my friend John Sviokla. He calls the need to cultivate patient urgency. Patient urgency is the recognition that in innovation, timing is everything, but if you wait until the market is ready and everybody else is ready to start, you'll be slow, you'll be late. So how can you cultivate the urgency to work on high potential opportunities and the patience to launch it when it's ready? So a couple of quick examples of that. Sir James Dyson, more than 5,000 design iterations till he got to a working vacuum. And then after he hit that, captured the markets across the world, made billions of dollars. Reed Hastings, when he started Netflix, he knew the future of movies was streaming video over the internet. He spent 10 years working on various iterations of that, sometimes going to the point where he was ready to launch but decided the market wasn't ready. He knew that that was the future. That's why the name, Netflix. But he had the patience and the urgency to work on different possibilities and wait until the technology and infrastructure was ready. As you think about your own innovation efforts, where are those efforts around those high potential opportunities that you know the market is not ready for, but you also know you will be ready when the market is ready? As Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. Are you prepared to take advantage of those chances? So as you think about shaping the digital transformation of insurance, and you're the thought leaders, you're the innovators, you're the early warriors in this process, here are 5 questions to remember. 1, are you embracing the gap? Are you thinking big enough? Are you starting small? Are you set up to learn? Are you cultivating patient urgency inside your organization? So this is not an environment that allows for questions all day long. I'll be here after the talk. If you want a copy of the slides, please feel free to drop me an email. And thank you.